I want to tell you about a number, 1000 lux. That's approximately the light level you'd find outdoors on a heavily overcast morning in January in northern climates. There's no sun visible, just grey cloud from horizon to horizon, the kind of flat white sky that makes you feel like the day hasn't quite started. It's cold, probably damp, not a morning that looks or feels like it has anything to offer. Now, inside your house with the lights on, the way most of us spend our mornings, somewhere between 100 and 300 lux is what we get. Maybe 400 if we have particularly good overhead lighting and if you're standing directly beneath it. I know this because I've measured it. I stood in my kitchen one winter morning with the lights on, with the kettle on, the normal morning chaos happening around me, and I held up my phone. There's a free light meter app that takes about 30 seconds to download. And then the reading came up on the screen. Then I walked to the back door, opened it, stepped out onto the porch. Same app, same phone, didn't even fully leave the covered area. The number more than tripled on a grey morning without a single ray of sunshine anywhere in the sky. And that number, that gap between what's inside and what's outside, even when outside looks dark and miserable and entirely uninviting, that's what this episode is about, because I talk to a lot of women who've heard the advice about morning light, who understand on some level that it matters, but who have quietly filed it under the not applicable to me because they live in the UK or Ireland or somewhere in a northern grey climate where the sky is grey for months on end, and the whole thing feels like advice written for people who have actual sunny weather. And I completely understand that response. I had it myself for a really long time, but the number doesn't lie. And once you understand what your biology is actually measuring when it detects morning light, which turns out to be something very specific and something very different from what most of us assume, and the grey climate objection falls apart completely, not as a matter of willpower or pushing through the cold, as a matter of the actual mechanism, and that's what we're getting into today. So I'm your host, Frances. A quick thing before we go any further. If you want the complete foundation for everything I cover in this episode, the full picture of how light, food timing, and nervous system regulation all work together, I have a free masterclass at francesnorgate.com/masterclass. It's about an hour and it walks you through all 4 pillars that I created. You can access that whenever you like at francesnorgate.com/masterclass. If you're new here, it's worth watching before or alongside these episodes, but you don't need it to follow today's episode. Right, let's get started. I'm Frances Norgate, a certified nutrition and lifestyle advisor, currently completing my BSc in nutritional therapy as well. And I work at the intersection of circadian biology and nutrition, and the short version of everything I do is this. Your body needs specific environmental signals at specific times, and when it doesn't get them, everything downstream, your energy, your hormones, your metabolism, your sleep, becomes harder to regulate. My job is to help you understand what these signals are and how to actually give your body what it needs in a climate and lifestyle and a life that isn't exactly optimized for biological well-being. And as always, this isn't medical advice, so if you have any specific health concerns, please do work with your healthcare provider. This is about understanding your biology better, not replacing proper medical care. So I want to start with the assumption underneath the grey climate objection, because I think it's worth naming precisely, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. The assumption is this: morning light advice is about the subjective experience of brightness. It's about stepping into a sunny garden and feeling the warmth on your face and receiving some kind of well-being benefit from that sensory experience. And in grey climates, you don't have that experience available to you, so the advice doesn't apply. And I completely understand where that assumption comes from, because the way morning light is talked about in a lot of wellness content, all golden hour photography and dewy gardens, absolutely suggests that what we're after is a pleasant experience in pleasant conditions. So if you live somewhere that doesn't provide pleasant conditions for 8 months of the year, it's entirely reasonable to conclude that this particular recommendation isn't for you. But that's not what the biology is doing at all. Your circadian clock is not measuring whether your morning feels nice. It's not detecting the subjective quality of light experience. It's measuring something very specific and very physical. The intensity of ambient light reaching a particular set of cells at the back of your eyes. And those cells have a threshold, a minimum intensity level that they need to activate and send a signal to your brain's master clock. And that threshold is set by evolution over millions of years, during which humans spent their mornings outdoors in every kind of weather and every kind of climate. It's calibrated for outdoor light, not for sunny outdoor light, just outdoor light. The kind that exists above cloud cover, filtered through grey skies on mornings that look and feel completely unremarkable. The reason the grey climate feels like it shouldn't work is that we're using our subjective experience of brightness as a proxy for what our biology is actually measuring, and those two things are very poorly correlated. Your eyes are extraordinarily good at adapting to different lighting environments. It's one of the things that makes human vision so impressive. You can walk from a bright outdoor environment into a dim room, and within minutes your vision has adjusted and everything looks normal again, and that adaptation is your visual system doing its job. But the same adaptation means you can't trust your subjective sense of how bright things are. Your perception of brightness is relative and constantly adjusting. So what feels dim outside in January is not dim in any absolute sense. It's dim relative to what you remember summer looking like. It's dim relative to your expectations, but the actual number, the lux level your eyes are receiving, is still orders of magnitude higher than what you're receiving indoors. And that gap between perception and measurement is the entire basis of the grey climate objection. People think there's no useful light because it doesn't feel bright, but their circadian rhythm is not working from feelings, it's working from lux, the intensity of light. And when you actually measure it, when you hold up a phone app and take a reading inside and then step outside and take it again, the gap is so large that it's genuinely difficult to maintain the belief that outdoor morning exposure doesn't matter on grey days. A threefold difference, often more, sometimes tenfold or higher, depending on how overcast the sky is and how well lit your indoor space is. That measurement, more than any explanation I could give you about photoreceptors or circadian biology, tends to shift things for people, because it's not a claim or an argument, it's a number, and the number is doing something different from what we expected. So let me explain the biology, because I think it helps to understand the mechanism even if you don't need all the details. And I'm going to try to keep this accessible rather than going down a photobiology rabbit hole, because the principle is what matters. You have two kinds of light detecting cells in your eyes. The first are the ones you're probably aware of, which are the rods and cones, and these are your vision cells. They're what allow you to form images, detect color, see in low light. They're extraordinarily sensitive enough that on a clear night you can navigate by moonlight if you give your eyes time to adapt. Your rods and cones are designed for the full range of light conditions you might encounter, from very dim to very bright. But there's a second type of cell in your retina that most people have never heard of, and this is the one that matters for everything we're talking about today, and they are called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. Researchers often call them ipRGCs because the full name's a bit much for normal conversation. These cells have a completely different job from your rods and cones. They're not involved in image formation at all. They don't help you see. Their only function is to detect the ambient light level in your environment, how bright it is overall, not what you're looking at, and send that information directly to a tiny structure inside your brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, your master circadian clock. So think of them as the light meter for your internal timing system. Now, while your rods and cones are forming the image of the world, your ipRGCs are just measuring how bright is it in here, and is that bright enough to mean it's daytime? Now, here's the part that explains everything about why grey days work. These cells contain a photopigment called melanopsin, and melanopsin has a very specific sensitivity profile. It responds primarily to short wavelength light, the blue-green part of the spectrum, roughly around 480 nanometers if you want to get specific, and it requires significantly more light intensity to activate than your rods and cones do. Your rods and cones can fire on moonlight. Your ipRGCs need something closer to daylight intensity. They're calibrated for the outdoor environment, not the indoor one, which means that the same visual system that lets you see perfectly well in your well-lit kitchen is not delivering sufficient light to your circadian clock. Your kitchen looks bright to your rods and cones, but to your ipRGCs, it's essentially darkness. And this is not a design flaw, it's completely intentional, or rather, it's the outcome of millions of years of evolution during which the appropriate signal for daytime was outdoor light. And indoor light simply didn't exist back then. Your circadian rhythm evolved in an environment where if it was bright enough to see clearly, you were outside. The idea that you might be inside under artificial light that's bright enough for vision but far too dim for circadian calibration is a very recent problem that your biology hasn't had time to adapt to. So when you're indoors all morning under artificial light, even very good artificial light, even the daylight spectrum bulbs that are marketed as supporting energy and mood, your ipRGCs are receiving a signal that is, by their standards, inadequate. They're not firing the way they're designed to. The signal to your suprachiasmatic nucleus is weak or absent, and your master clock doesn't get its daily calibration. And what happens when the master clock doesn't get calibrated? Well, the downstream effects that we've been covering in previous episodes. So your cortisol awakening response is blunted, the sharp morning peak that's supposed to give you energy and alertness doesn't happen properly. Your melatonin timer doesn't start running reliably, which means your evening sleep preparation is compromised. Your leptin rhythm, that 24-hour cycle we talked about in the weight loss episode, starts to drift. And all of these hormones depend on the master clock for their timing, and the master clock depends on the ipRGCs for its morning calibration. So now it's really important just to step outside, even on a grey, overcast January morning in a northern climate where it's really grey. The sky above those clouds is still lit by the sun. The ambient outdoor light level, even heavily filtered through cloud cover, is still somewhere between 10 and 100 times higher than your indoor lighting. And your ipRGCs, which are calibrated for outdoor light and require outdoor level intensity to activate properly, start receiving the signal they need. They start firing and they send information to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Your master clock receives its morning calibration, the cortisol awakening response runs properly, the melatonin timer starts, the whole downstream hormonal sequence gets its anchor for the day, and none of that required sunshine at all. It required outdoor ambient light intensity, which is available to you anywhere, in January even. So you just have to actually go outside to receive it. The melanopsin in your ipRGCs don't care whether your morning feels nice. It doesn't care whether the sky is blue or grey or an uninspiring shade of cloud white. It's measuring intensity, and outdoors, even at its most miserable, the intensity is there. Now, I want to tell you about something that happens regularly in my life, because I think it probably mirrors something that happens in yours if you've actually started taking any of this seriously. I've been doing this for long enough now that it's genuinely part of my routine. Going outside in the morning is as automatic to me now as making coffee. I just don't think about it much anymore. And I don't have to motivate myself anymore. It just happens. But the people around me, the people I love, the people whose opinions I respect, have pretty consistent responses to it. And that response ranges from good-natured bafflement to fairly direct skepticism. My husband's used to this by this point, so he's watched me walk out the back door in, various states of preparedness, sometimes with a proper coat, sometimes very much not, for long enough now that it's just become part of the background for our life together. And I've actually got my family to start doing this as well, and they're actually really enjoying it now. So they don't question it anymore. But early on, when I was first implementing this and first started to talk about it and why it mattered, there was definitely a phase of, yeah, what exactly are you doing out there? Not in a hostile way, just puzzled about, what am I doing now? Sort of thing. I keep trying different things. So he probably just thought this was another phase of some sort. Some of my friends are a bit more direct, so I've had conversations and these keep happening and they haven't stopped, where someone says, essentially, come on, it's Ireland, there's no light here. You can tell yourself you're getting a circadian benefit, but you're standing in the grey and the cold. Surely it's not doing anything. And they say it kindly in the way you gently correct someone who had a slightly eccentric but harmless habit. And they're not trying to be dismissive. They genuinely think I've convinced myself that something's working when it objectively isn't, because clearly there's no light worth speaking of on a grey Irish morning. And I've had this conversation enough times now with enough different people that I've learned something about how to handle it. What I used to do was explain. I'd talk about ipRGCs and the lux and the suprachiasmatic nucleus and research on morning light exposure and circadian calibration. And I'd watch people's eyes just glaze over about 30 seconds in. And I'd keep going anyway because I was convinced that if I could just explain it properly, they would understand. And they would nod politely and then say something like, yeah, but it's still grey outside. So I don't do that anymore. What I do now is a lot simpler. I tell them about the number. So I say, I measured it. I was inside with the lights on, about 150 lux. I stepped outside and it was over 1,000 lux on the same grey morning with no sun, just on the other side of the door. And then I just stopped talking because hearing a number is a different kind of argument from an explanation. An explanation requires someone to follow like a chain of reasoning, to accept several intermediate steps, to update their mental model. And that's hard to do in the middle of a conversation when you didn't come prepared to think about photobiology and you've got your children standing there next to you, asking you questions and you can't concentrate. But a number, just a simple number, a measurement, something concrete and specific, that lands a bit differently. It doesn't ask them to follow a chain of reasoning. It just asks them to consider that the gap between indoors and outdoors might be much larger than they assumed. And most people, when presented with that number, go quiet for a moment because it's genuinely surprising. It doesn't match what they thought was happening. And I'm not telling you this because I think you need to convince the skeptics in your life. You genuinely don't. What other people think about your morning routine has no bearing on whether it works. But I think a lot of women who start implementing something like this feel a kind of low-level pressure from the people around them who think it's a bit much, and that pressure can erode consistency over time. If your husband's rolling his eyes every morning when you put on your coat, or your friends keep telling you the light is doing nothing, then it kind of adds friction and it makes you question yourself on the miserable mornings when you were already questioning yourself. So the number's useful not just for convincing other people, it's useful for yourself. So if you download the app once and take the measurement once, and you have a concrete reference point for the moments when your own internal skeptic shows up and asks whether this is really worth it. Because on a February morning when it's dark and damp and cold and you genuinely can't see the point of going outside, the answer is 1,000 lux versus 150. That's why. Not because it feels like it's doing something, but because the measurement says it's doing something, regardless of how it feels. And the other thing I'd say is this. The people who are skeptical of you doing this are almost certainly not doing it themselves, which means that they're spending their mornings inside under indoor lighting, their ipRGCs not receiving the calibration signal, their master clock drifting, their cortisol timing getting messier. They're experiencing the downstream effects of not getting that morning signal, that the energy that's less stable, the sleep that's less restorative, the afternoons that are harder than they should be, and they don't know it because they don't have a comparison point. You will have a comparison point, and after a few weeks of consistent outdoor mornings, the difference becomes clear enough that the skepticism stops bothering you, not because you've convinced anyone, just because you know what you know, why grey climates make this more urgent and not less. And there's a counterintuitive point I want to make here that I think is genuinely important, and it's one that I don't hear about that much. So if you live in a reliably sunny climate, Southern Europe, California, somewhere with consistent clear skies, your body's probably receiving adequate morning light exposure almost by accident. You walk to your car and you get 10 minutes of outdoor light, then you sit at a cafe or breakfast and the sun comes through the window, you open a door to take out the recycling, and you've inadvertently given your ipRGCs a meaningful signal. You're not being intentional about it because you didn't need to be. The light finds you. But if you live in the UK or Ireland or any northern grey climate, you can go an entire week, sometimes longer, without spending any meaningful time outdoors in daylight. Not because you're being negligent, but because the weather is genuinely uninviting, because your commute happens in the dark, because your home and office and car form an indoor circuit that you move through without ever really stepping outside into the ambient sky. And the cumulative effect of that is significant in a way that builds slowly and isn't obvious until it's quite pronounced. Your circadian rhythm doesn't have a hard edge. It doesn't function perfectly and then suddenly fail on day 5 of no morning light. It drifts gradually across days and weeks of insufficient calibration signal. Your cortisol timing shifts a little, your melatonin onset shifts a little, the whole rhythm loses the anchor that keeps it sharp and becomes softer, more variable, and less robust. This is, I think, one of the real reasons why rates of seasonal low mood, fatigue, and sleep disruption are so much higher in northern latitudes than they are closer to the equator. It's not just about reduced total daylight hours, though that's real and it does matter. It's about the fact that the reduced daylight hours make it very easy to go through your day without ever receiving proper circadian calibration signals. The light exists, people just aren't getting it. So think about this from a historical perspective for a moment. Your ancestors in northern climates where it's grey, people whose circadian biology in all the relevant ways is your circadian biology, they lived in this climate their entire lives and they didn't have the option to stay inside because the weather was unpleasant. They went outside because their lives required it. They worked outdoors, or they walked to get to where they needed to be, or they maintained animals or land that had to be attended to regardless of the weather. They were getting outdoor light exposure every single day, whether it was grey skies or raining or not because it was pleasant, but because it was unavoidable. But we've insulated ourselves from the inconvenience of weather so thoroughly that we've also insulated ourselves from something our biology depends on. Central heating means there's no reason to leave the house when it's cold, and cars mean there's no need to walk anywhere in the elements. Online shopping means you can go days without leaving the house, and our circadian systems, which are ancient, evolved under very different conditions, are running on the assumption that morning means outdoors, because for the entire history of human evolution, it did. So the grey climate isn't the problem. The grey climate combined with modern indoor life is the problem. And the solution isn't moving somewhere sunny, though I wouldn't pretend that doesn't sound appealing in January. The solution is doing something your ancestors did automatically, which is going outside in the morning, regardless of weather, because your biology needs you to. The irony is that for someone in northern climates, being deliberate about this matters more than it does for someone who lives in Madrid or somewhere sunny, who has a permissive environment and light that finds them. You have a challenging environment. You have to seek the light out, which makes the habit more important, not less. And it makes missing days more consequential. I realise that sounds demanding, but 15 to 20 minutes isn't really a significant portion of your day. You know, it's a cup of tea's worth of time. It's one episode of something on your phone. If you wanted to walk outside while you listen, the cost is really quite low, but the reason it feels high is that it requires going outside when staying inside is warmer and more comfortable. And we might also have other demands as well that we need to attend to. And I don't want to minimize how real that friction is on a wet morning in February, but the alternative, staying inside, skipping the calibration, letting the rhythm drift, has costs too. You're just paying them later in a different currency. Okay, so let's get practical, because I know some of you are listening and thinking, I understand the principle, I'm persuaded, but what does this actually look like on a specific, real dark Tuesday morning in November, or we're in February now, I suppose, when I have to be at my desk by 8:30 in the morning and the sun doesn't come up until after 8. So let me work through the main scenarios, because the practical questions matter and the answers are more flexible than the advice often implies. So with regards to timing, in summer this is fairly uncomplicated. It gets light early, so you go outside early and that's done. But in winter, in northern latitudes, it can be genuinely dark until 7:30, 8, 9 o'clock in some places, 10 o'clock even, especially in December and January, which means that the advice to go outside within the first hour of waking up is physically impossible for part of the year if you wake up before it's light. So what you do instead is this: you separate the morning light exposure from the immediate post-waking window and attach it to when it is actually light. So if it gets light at 8 and you've been up since 6:30, you go outside at 8 o'clock, or you build the outdoor exposure around something that naturally happens around that time, like the school run, a short walk before starting work, standing outside with a cup of tea once there's enough light in the sky to matter. The mechanism doesn't care whether you went out at 6:30 or 8:15. It cares whether you went out when there was light to receive. So in practice, for most women in northern climates, this means being a little bit more flexible about when outdoor time happens, rather than being really rigid about it happening immediately after waking up, for example. The goal is getting it done in the morning before the day has fully, swallowed your attention, not at a specific time. So for duration, this is a dosage question, and the answer scales with the light intensity available. So on a clear summer morning, your ipRGCs can receive a meaningful calibration signal in 5 to 10 minutes. The intensity is high, the signal lands quickly, but on a grey winter day, you need longer. So 15 to 20 minutes is a reasonable minimum. If it's particularly dark and overcast, erring towards 20 to 25 minutes doesn't hurt either. You're compensating for lower intensity with longer exposure time. So what you're doing during that time doesn't particularly matter. You don't need to exercise, though walking is lovely if it fits. You don't need to face east or stare at the sky. You just need to be outside with your eyes open and available to the ambient light, not looking at your phone screen, not wearing sunglasses. The cells doing the work are in your eyes, so they need access to the sky. So if it's raining, this is the one that stops most people most often, and I want to be really direct about it. So rain's not a reason to skip. If you have a covered porch or doorsteps, just stand there. If you have an umbrella, that's fine. Ambient skylight comes from above and around you, not just from directly over your head. So an umbrella doesn't block meaningful amounts of light. So if it's genuinely torrential and your only option is getting completely soaked with no shelter, then you might reasonably just shorten the time rather than skip it entirely. 5 wet minutes outside is still better than 0. But rain on its own with any kind of basic protection is not the barrier it feels like. So I do most of the outdoor time from a small covered area on our patio. On days when the rain's really heavy, that's where I tend to stand. Otherwise, I tend to go for a walk if I can. It's 15 minutes of standing in a covered porch looking at wet grass, but the lux reading that I get outside, even under the covered porch, is, still 10 to 15 times lighter than my kitchen, because ambient light comes from the whole sky, not just above the patch that's directly above me. Now, people ask about windows as a compromise, and can they sit by a south-facing window and count that? And the honest answer is it's better than being at the back of a dim room, but it's not equivalent to being outside either. So glass filters some of the wavelengths that Melanopsin is most sensitive to, and it significantly reduces overall light intensity. So a bright, clear, large south-facing window on a sunny day gets you partway there. A north-facing window on a grey day does very little, but if being outside is genuinely impossible through illness, mobility issues, circumstances you can't control, then a window is your best available option. But if the choice is between outside in the cold and inside by the window for comfort reasons, outside wins every time. The gap is large enough that comfort shouldn't be the deciding factor. And one thing I'd genuinely recommend doing just once is to download a free light meter app and take the measurements. Inside with the lights on and outside from your door or porch. Write the numbers down, and that comparison will do more for your consistency on difficult mornings than any amount of understanding the biology, because it gives you a concrete reference point when your motivation is low. The number is the argument. The number is what you come back to when your internal skeptic shows up at 7:30 in the rain and asks whether this is really necessary. I also want to say something about the seasonal side of this that I think is worth sitting with, because it tends to go against the grain of how most of us have been taught to think about our energy and productivity. So your body is not designed to behave the same way in January as it does in June. The circadian system is specifically responsive to seasonal changes in light. The length of the day, the angle of the sun, the quality and quantity of light available, these changes are signals. Your biology is meant to respond to them. So in summer, the long days and high intensity light create a hormonal and metabolic environment that supports high energy, longer active periods, and often lower sleep need. In winter, the short days and lower light intensity shift things. So you may genuinely need more sleep. Your energy may plateau at a lower level regardless of what you do. Your appetite might shift towards heavier, more calorie-dense foods. These are not personal failures or signs that something is wrong. They're appropriate biological responses to the light environment changing. The problem is that we've largely decoupled our behavior from these seasonal shifts. We work the same hours, maintain the same output expectations, eat roughly the same foods, and then feel like something's wrong with us when our energy doesn't match what it was in July. And then we reach for coffee and supplements and willpower to bridge the gap, rather than asking whether the gap is to some extent appropriate. What this means practically for morning light is that winter requires more effort and more time for less return. You're working with shorter daylight windows, lower light intensity, and a biological system that is to some degree naturally winding down its output in response to reduced light. The deliberate outdoor exposure is doing two things. So it's giving your circadian rhythm the calibration signal that it needs to stay anchored, and it's providing the best available compensation for the reduced ambient light in your environment. But it's not going to make January feel like July, nor should it. The frame I find most useful is winter is a different season with different requirements, not a defective version of summer. So you dress differently, you probably eat somewhat differently. It makes sense that your morning light routine would look a little bit different. So you have a longer duration, more deliberate timing, more attention to not skipping, and that your energy expectations for the day would be calibrated accordingly. And interestingly, for women in their 40s specifically, who are often already navigating the hormonal shifts of perimenopause, which themselves affect circadian stability, the seasonal fluctuation in light can amplify existing patterns. The circadian system becomes less robust when estrogen declines, which means it's more vulnerable to the kind of signal disruption that short, dark winters create, which is again an argument for being more deliberate about outdoor morning light in winter months, not less. We'll get much more into that perimenopausal circadian connection next week, but it's worth noting here because for a lot of the women listening to this, the combination of perimenopause and winter in a grey climate is a particularly challenging one. Not an impossible one, but one that asks for more deliberate support of the things your biology depends on. So just to give you a little bit of a practical protocol here. So basically be concrete, simple, and in order. So first, go outside every morning as soon as it's light, or within the first hour of waking if it's already light when you wake up. Fully outside, not just near a window or standing in an open doorway with your body inside, but with your eyes available to the sky, without sunglasses. And then secondly, stay outside for at least 15 to 20 minutes on grey or overcast days. 10 minutes would be your minimum on clear days. And the darker and more overcast it is, the longer you need. And thirdly, don't use rain as a reason to skip. Use a porch, an umbrella, a raincoat, a covered doorstep. The ambient light is still there. You just need to be outside rather than inside. Fourth, in winter, when mornings are dark, detach the routine from the immediate post-waking windows. So go outside when it's light, even if that's at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock. Build it around the school run, a walk before work, a cup of tea on the porch when there's finally light worth receiving in the sky. Fifth, download a free light meter app and take the indoor-outdoor measurements just at least once and write the numbers down. Keep them somewhere useful for the mornings when you're questioning whether it's worth it. And sixth, and this is less about the mechanism and more about sustainability, find the version of this that fits your actual life rather than the idealized version. So it doesn't have to be a mindful, peaceful, phone-free experience in a beautiful garden. It can be standing under a small roof, looking at wet grass for 15 minutes while you answer emails. The mechanism doesn't care about the aesthetics, it cares about the looks. So if you really have to be on your phone checking emails and that sort of thing, it's still better to do it outside than to be inside. And a realistic timeline for this would be in week 1, you might not notice that much of a change. Your circadian rhythm's beginning to recalibrate. The effects will be subtle at first. Some people notice falling asleep slightly more easily in the evening, and most people notice nothing really that specific in week 1. But in weeks 2 and 3, this is typically where sleep quality starts to shift. Waking in the night becomes less frequent, feeling more ready to sleep at a reasonable hour rather than fighting wakefulness until late. And for those who are waking up at 3 a.m. every night, a pattern we talked about last week, this is often when that starts to ease as well. And then weeks 4 to 6, energy during the day starts to feel more stable. The afternoon is less of a battle. You're not necessarily transformed, but the baseline is higher and the crashes are less steep. For women who were relying on multiple coffees to get through the day, this is often when the need for that third or fourth cup starts to diminish. Then months 2 to 3 are consolidation, so the rhythm's now got an anchor. So missing a morning here and there doesn't send things sideways the way it might have done in week 1. The system's more robust because it's been consistently calibrated. As always, this is just one piece. It works best alongside consistent meal timing, evening light management, and nervous system regulation. Those pieces compound each other, But this is a good place to start because it's the signal that everything else builds on. So, the grey climate objection. I understand it. It looks like it shouldn't work. It feels like it's not doing anything. The people around you will probably raise an eyebrow, and on the dark, damp, genuinely miserable mornings, and there will be those mornings, that's just February, it will require something from you that nice weather doesn't. But 1,000 lux outdoors versus 150 inside on the same grey morning, well, that gap is real, and your circadian clock is measuring it even if you can't perceive it. You just have to go outside to receive it. If you want to understand how morning light fits into the full system, how it connects to your leptin rhythm and your cortisol timing and your evening sleep and preparation and all the other pieces we've been working through in this series, I have a free masterclass at francisnorgate.com/masterclass. It's about an hour long. It walks through all of my 4 pillars together. And if you want to be on the waiting list for the Quantum Nourishment Blueprint, which is opening this spring, and brings all of these pieces together in sequence with implementation, detail, and troubleshooting, that's at francisnorgate.com/waitlist. And if you're not already subscribed to my weekly newsletter, Quantum Nourishment Weekly, which contains 1 practical circadian strategy per week, the research I'm reading, and what I'm testing, you can subscribe at francisnorgate.com/resources or find me on Substack at francisnorgate.substack.com. Next week, we're talking about perimenopause, and specifically about something that most perimenopause content doesn't touch. The fact that estrogen isn't just a reproductive hormone, it's one of the things that keeps your body clock stable. As estrogen declines, the circadian clock becomes less robust, which means everything we've been covering in this series, the morning light, the meal timing, the nervous system piece, matters even more during perimenopause, not less. So if you've noticed that everything that used to work stopped working in the last few years, and you've been putting that down to just getting older or just perimenopause, there's more to the picture. So we'll get into that next week. Thank you so much for listening. Take care, and I'll see you next week.